Vietnam draft dodgers were a turning point in American history because they changed the perspective of war for Americans during this time. During Vietnam, many men were called to support their country via the draft. This brought out many draft dodgers, and there was hatred for a war they did not support. In this era, dodgers were looked on as normal instead of the usual shunning towards them. Instead of men flying over to Vietnam to fight for a war they did not support, they tried to take steps to flunk their physicals or to even run and hide in Canada.
What is a draft dodger? Real people's opinions coming up.
A draft dodger is one who did not go through the formal process to become a conscientious objector and maybe move to Canada to escape serving in the military. There were some who found different ways that they could flunk their physical so that they would not be drafted.
Draft dodgers became known as people who either did not enter the draft, so they failed to register, or they registered the draft and then when their number was called, they either went into hiding in the United States or they ran to Canada or Mexico or another country that gave safe haven to draft dodgers or people who were avoiding service to their country.
What were the reasons?
Well, draft dodgers, there are several different reasons why they avoided the draft or avoided service to their country. Number one, conscription was the law of the United States of America. So by very nature of being a draft dodger that did not register for the draft, you were a criminal at the time. A lot of different reasons led up to that. Number one, if you were a conscientious objector that didn't understand the rules of the draft, that would be one reason. If you were afraid, and this is a natural aversion to combat, if you were afraid of actually being involved in the fight and being injured or killed, that's another good reason to, have hesitancy about wanting to serve your country. I think some people, because of the hype of the time, and I always like to think of things as far as time, place, and circumstance, it was probably, in society at that time, it was probably considered like the hip thing to do, was to try and avoid service and then draw attention to yourself. So those are a couple reasons that people would be draft dodgers.
The consequences of being a draft dodger.
Well, for me, being a conscientious objector, I was by law required to do 2 years of community service. Actually, that's how I ended up in South Bend. I was going to school in New York City and working for the public library there, but my draft board said I had to relocate to do my community service, or alternate service as it's called. After we moved to South Bend, the war ended, and so I was not at that point required to do community service. However, some of the other consequences, as I entered political life, as I first ran for office, one of my opponents made an issue of my having been a conscientious objector during the war. He had served in the war, and he thought it was inappropriate for me to be running for public office. Obviously, the voters decided differently, but it was an issue that came up again during my career, and has been something that has been actually an interesting point of conversation for me as I've matured and participated in a variety of activities in the community.
Protesters during the time.
Well, I'm a pacifist, so I don't think we should be intervening in any war. And so I certainly was against the Vietnam War, which turned out to be just a ruse. I mean, they faked the bombing of that ship that they used as an excuse to get into the Vietnam War. And so it was similar to Iraq, it was the same kind of situation where there was no basis for us intervening in Vietnam. Notre Dame had a student strike, and people didn't go to class, and the teachers didn't teach. At St. Mary's, I was the only teacher who didn't teach. Everybody else went ahead and taught, but I supported the strike, and so it was pretty tense. The whole thing surrounding kinds of things like CIA interviewing and that kind of thing, which people got upset about, and then Some people locked the board of trustees at Notre Dame into the education center where they were meeting, and there were 10 students who got suspended from Notre Dame. The 15-minute. I was arrested in Washington D.C. when they tried to shut down all the bridges and all the roads coming into the city. We went out to the middle of the street and sat down, and the police would come on these little motor scooters and run up us, but they were pretty light, so they didn't really hurt very much. But then they arrested 1,200 people, or no, 12,000 people were arrested at that point. And they put them in the football stadium and jails, and everything was filled to overflowing with people.
Choices of draft dodgers and veterans alike.
Each person had to make their own decision at that point. The people who decided to go to the war did make one decision, and people who were draft dodgers and decided to either go to Canada or into hiding, or many people just went to jail. I mean, instead of going to the war, they refused to be inducted, and so they were arrested and tried and convicted, and they went to jail. I know I had some friends that served 3 or 4 years in prison for that. So I certainly think that the people who went to prison were just as fair as the people who went to Vietnam. And they took the consequences of their actions. They made a decision, and whatever happened to them, that was okay. The people who fled to Canada, I don't know. They probably, maybe not as fair for them as it was for the people who went. But you had to make a decision in those times. It was not like, it wasn't an academic exercise. It was real life. You either went and perhaps died, or you refused to go and went to jail, or you fled and went to Canada. You didn't have like a lot of opportunity to muddle over the kinds of things. And so it was.
Draft dodging charges.
Depending on what they did, President Carter gave amnesty to all the draft dodgers. I forget the exact year, but I think it was sometime around 1974. So he gave them amnesty, so they were basically excused from any criminal charges for being draft dodgers. But depending on what they did, whether they failed to register, whether they went to another country, whether they avoided taxes during that time, the charges against them could have been very minor, or they could have added up. But for the actual act of not registering for the draft and being a draft dodger, they were given clemency by the President of the United States.
Do you think Dodgers of the Vietnam War changed the sentiment of American support for the war?
I think that the people that were draft dodgers think they changed the sentiment of the war, and in reality, I don't believe they had any effect.
I think there were a number of things that helped to sway public opinion about the war in Vietnam. Certainly protesters, some of whom were draft dodgers or some of whom were conscientious objectors, some of whom had served in the military and believed that this war was inappropriate. And I think that those were probably the strongest voices, those who had served and came home to say, this is not a war that is appropriate for our country to be engaged in. But those public protests certainly had a big role in helping people, challenge people how they thought about whether we should be in Vietnam or not. I think the other extraordinary factor was that this was a war you could watch on your TV in your living room. And World War I, World War II, you would get newsreels and you would see pictures of that if you went to the movies or other things. But this was every night there would be pictures on the news about different atrocities that were happening, or certainly the number count of people dying, both American and Vietnamese. And all of that, I think, together worked to help sway public opinion.
Back in '69, I didn't have a care. Before they called my number, I chopped off all my hair.